Welcome to PoliticIt Talk, where we talk about political strategy. I'm Josh Light.
And I'm Sterling Morris.
And today we're going to be talking about undecided voters. And undecided voters, they're the hardest voters to find. They're interesting, too, because if there's lots of undecided voters in a race where you're running against an incumbent or you are the incumbent, generally what happens is towards the end of that race, towards election day, the lead usually narrows. But there's also another interesting correlation that you find. If there's few undecided voters in a race and there's an incumbent in this race, generally what happens is the incumbent's lead will increase as you approach election day.
Undecided voters are hard to find, but the good news is there are a lot of voters who are easy to find. People who register under parties are typically voters who are not undecided.
Yeah, and a person's motivation for voting really comes from a number of sources and shows up in the past voting records. And you can usually predict partisan affiliation by looking at marital status or geography. For example, generally, urban African American will likely vote Democrat, whereas on the flip side, a married couple with kids that are living in a rural area is probably going to vote Republican.
One of the strongest variables to consider is if the individual is registered under a party. Now, not all states require voters to register prior to voting, but many states do. And so if that variable is available to you, the top indicator is if that person has registered for a party, and those who don't register are often more likely to be undecided.
One of the really important things that you need to do if you're running for office is getting a voter list, because voter lists are just loaded with information that can help you figure out party affiliation, like age, gender, geography, voting history. Sometimes it has household or commercial data and precinct targeting too. But you really get what you pay for, though, because oftentimes if you get it from the state, the data can be not quite as good as if you buy a list from a private company. For instance, the state voter list might have people that have passed away on it, so that doesn't really help you. Or it can also have incorrect addresses and information like that, so the geography variable probably won't be as strong if you get it from the state as opposed if you get it from a private company.
Since we're talking about identifying undecided voters, there are a few variables that are powerful, and really the most powerful variable is if someone is a non-partisan voter, if someone's registered as an independent voter. And like I said, in states where voters have to register, if there's an option for a voter to register as an independent, that's a very, very strong indicator that she or he is undecided. In fact, about 50% of independent voters are typically undecided voters up until just before Election Day. If your state doesn't require you to register as a voter, there's another way to find nonpartisan voters who are also, like I said, likely persuadable voters. You can look at voters who participated in party primaries. Of those who participate, they're much less likely to be persuadable. So if you find a voter who has not participated in a party primary, you have someone who's 17% more likely to be persuadable than the general electorate.
That's right. And Sterling, another way that you can actually find undecided voters is by looking for people who don't vote very often. But there's some pros and cons to this. People who don't vote very often are also 26% more likely to be an undecided voter. But because they don't vote very often, even though you might go and persuade them to vote for you, they might not actually go and vote on election day. So that's the con to that. So I would say probably the best time to go after these kinds of voters is during a presidential election, because you're going to have a higher turnout. So maybe in 2016, if that's when you're planning to run, these might be good people to go against or go after. But in 2014, where you don't have a presidential election, this might not be the kind of voters that you should go after.
You can also look at the length of registration of a voter. If a voter has recently registered for the ability to vote, that person's more likely to be persuadable. Typically, these types of people who are newly registered voters are less informed about candidates. And there's about a 14% correlation with them being persuadable and a new registrant.
You know, another variable that can be good for finding undecided voters is geography. It's interesting if you look at every single campaign across the country. Every person that's running will have a geographical area where people tend to support them. They tend to be strong supporters, and if you go after people in that area, they're going to be about 9% more likely to be persuaded to vote for you.
With all these small segments of voters, sometimes it's hard to zero down on who you should go for. So one thing that you can do is eliminate who you shouldn't go for, and this is what we call an eliminator variable. So an example would be is if you are running as a Democrat in a campaign, eliminator variable might be those who are registered as Democrats.
Yeah, that's right, Sterling. But for example, let's just go through a quick example here. Let's say I'm a Republican. I'm trailing a Democrat. I'm not going to go off and target Republican primary voters. That doesn't make sense because I'm trailing the Democrat. What you're probably going to want to do is you're probably going to be better off targeting soft supporters of your opponent. And soft supporters are probably not going to be people who voted in the Democratic primary. Those people that voted in the Democratic primary are probably strong supporters of your opponent in this case. So you should just eliminate all those individuals from your list of targets, and that really helps you clean up your list and makes you a lot more efficient.
One eliminator variable that you could use is a demographic variable that works particularly well if you're a Democrat, and that is African Americans. They're typically undecided during most of the election season, but by and large, they will vote for the Democratic nominee to the tune of about 80% support. So if you are a Democrat candidate, you have a good chance of securing these votes, and as such, you're going to be much more efficient by targeting other groups. But it's very important to remember that every campaign is different, and you need to know what differentiates you from your competitors. One of the things we found in some research that we've studied is that the best message that you can give to these undecided voters once you identify them is information that they didn't already know that they find interesting.
That's right, Sterling. But there are some instances in which you want to do a little bit different messaging when you're targeting undecided voters. Let's talk about mailers, for instance. If you're sending out a mailer, research shows that you want to do issues that voters have strong feelings about and they agree on. If you don't do this with mailers, generally people will just take that piece of mail and throw it in the garbage, and mailers are an expensive way to advertise, so you want to do it right. A new way that you can do it is through Facebook. Facebook's really great because it breaks down demographics, so you're able to actually target specific types of people, and if you can figure out the issues that those specific types of people have strong feelings about and they agree on, then you can actually do some very targeting, low-cost advertising through Facebook.
That's right. In summary, really the most effective way to find persuadable voters is to identify independent voters. That's your best target. And contacting non-primary voters is also effective, but only a third as effective as independent voters by some of the numbers we've seen.
And when you're talking about undecided voters, if you're targeting them, it can help the efficiencies in your campaign, but you got to remember it's not your meat and potatoes. Your meat and potatoes come from strong and soft supporters affiliated with your party.
Well, that's about it for today, and we just briefly talked about messaging, but next week we're really going to dive in and get into some good depth with how you should cater your messaging.
So tune in for next week. We'll tell you how to do messaging for specific demographics. Thanks for listening.
PoliticIt Talk is brought to you by PoliticIt. PoliticIt provides powerful real-time campaign analytics for politicians. Contact PoliticIt if you would like to be a beta tester.